By the time I reached the mountain road, the sun had already fallen behind the peaks, and the air had turned sharp enough to sting my lungs. I had come looking for a quiet place to rest, but the silence here felt deliberate, as if the mountain itself was listening. The village sat halfway up the slope, a cluster of old wooden houses clinging to the rock like frightened animals. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No dogs barked. When I knocked on the first door, the woman who answered stared at me with pale, exhausted eyes and said, "Do not go higher." I asked her what she meant, but she only crossed herself and shut the door. At the inn, if it could be called that, the owner gave me a room without speaking. He left a candle, a bowl of soup gone cold, and one warning whispered through his teeth. The kid in the mountain does not like strangers. I laughed at first, because mountain people tell stories to keep outsiders obedient. But that night, while the wind scraped the shutters, I heard footsteps outside my window. They were light, careful, and too small to belong to any grown man. When I looked, I saw only fog moving between the houses. At dawn, I followed the path the villagers refused to mention. It climbed past dead pines and broken stone markers, then narrowed into a trail that seemed carved by claws rather than tools. The higher I went, the colder it became, until even my breath looked like smoke from a grave. Near noon, I found a child standing on a ledge above the path. He wore a coat too large for him and had hair the color of wet ash. He did not wave or smile. He only watched me with a stillness so unnatural that I stopped breathing for a moment. I called out to him, asking if he was lost. The boy tilted his head, as if listening to someone behind me, and then he pointed deeper into the mountain. His finger was thin and dirty, and when he lowered it, I noticed his nails were blackened like burned wood. I should have turned back then. Instead, I climbed toward him. The ledge was empty when I reached it. No footprints, no sign of where he had gone. Only a narrow crack in the rock remained, breathing out a smell like wet soil and something older, something rotten beneath it. The crack was too small for a man, but the mountain had already begun to feel less like stone and more like a body. I pressed my ear to it and heard a sound from within, not wind, not water, but a child humming a lullaby in a voice that had no warmth at all. When I returned to the village, the people were waiting for me. They stood in the square without speaking, their faces turned upward as if they had been expecting my shadow before my body. The innkeeper asked where I had seen him, and when I said the ledge, every face went white. They brought me into the chapel, though it was little more than a room with a cracked bell and a blackened altar. There, an old woman with trembling hands told me the story. Years ago, a child vanished in a storm, and after that, the mountain began to answer when called. She said the boy had been found again, or what was left of him, standing at the cave mouth 3 nights later, soaked through and smiling. Since then, he appeared whenever someone climbed too high. He never spoke, only watched, and those who followed him never came back the same. I asked why they did not leave the mountain. The innkeeper answered before anyone else could. He said the roads below had collapsed long ago, though I knew that was a lie. His eyes darted toward the chapel wall, and I realized he was afraid not of escape, but of being heard. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching beneath the floorboards. It moved in circles, slow and patient, as if something below the room were searching for the right place to rise. Then came the humming again, soft as a mother's song, except no mother would sing like that. I lit the candle and found muddy footprints leading from the door to my bed. They were small, child-sized, but the toes were too long, almost bent backward. At the window, a pale face appeared for one heartbeat, pressed against the glass, and then vanished into the fog. At first light, I fled the inn and climbed again, this time with purpose. I wanted answers, or at least proof that I had not lost my mind. The trail ended at a cave hidden behind a curtain of hanging roots, and from inside came the sound of dripping water and quiet breathing. The cave walls were covered in marks, hundreds of them, carved low as if by a child kneeling in the dark. Some were names, some were dates, some were only lines crossing over and over until the stone looked bruised. Deeper in, I found a pile of shoes, all tiny, all empty. Then I saw the boy again, standing at the far end of the cave. This time he was closer, and I could see that his eyes reflected the lantern flame like a beast's. He raised one finger to his lips, not asking for silence, but warning me that something behind me had already heard us. I turned, and the lantern nearly fell from my hand. The cave behind me was no longer empty. Shapes moved in the dark, tall and thin, with joints that bent the wrong way. They did not rush. They simply waited, as if they knew I would eventually understand what they were. I ran until the cave spat me back into daylight. The mountain wind hit my face like ice, and I stumbled down the slope with the sound of those things scraping stone behind me. When I looked back, the boy stood at the entrance, watching calmly, as if he had only been waiting for me to leave. By the time I reached the village, the square was empty. Doors hung open. A pot still boiled on one hearth, but no one answered my calls. I found the chapel door swinging in the wind, and inside, the altar had been split open from top to bottom, as if something had clawed its way out. On the floor of the chapel lay the old woman, alive but shaking, her lips blue with terror. She grabbed my wrist and begged me to listen. The child was not the victim, she said. He was the door, and every time someone followed him into the mountain, something else learned the way down. She told me the mountain had once been sealed by fire and prayer long before the village existed. But children hear things adults cannot, and one boy had answered when the mountain called his name. After that, the seal weakened, and the mountain began wearing his face. I wanted to leave then, but the road below was gone. Not blocked, not broken, simply absent, as if the world had folded itself shut behind me. The only path left was upward, toward the highest ridge, where the wind screamed through the stones like voices trying to remember their names. I climbed through the night, following the sound of that humming. It led me to a summit where the earth had split open in a perfect circle. In the center stood the boy, barefoot on the edge of the wound, his coat fluttering like a torn flag in the storm. He looked at me with pity, and that was worse than hatred. Then he spoke for the first time, and his voice came from everywhere at once, from the rocks, the wind, and the dark below my feet. He said I had been invited because the mountain was hungry again. The ground trembled. The split in the earth widened, and from it rose a shape too large to understand at once, a mass of stone, roots, and something pale and wet beneath. I saw faces in it, half-formed and screaming, as if the mountain had been swallowing people for years and never finished chewing. The boy stepped aside, and I understood then that he had never been leading me away. He had been leading me here, to the mouth of the thing beneath the mountain. I grabbed the old prayer knife from my coat and drove it into the nearest glowing seam of flesh and stone. The mountain screamed. The sound tore through the night and shattered the ridge into falling fire and rock. The boy's face cracked like clay, and for one terrible instant I saw the child he had once been, crying silently inside the ruin. Then everything collapsed into darkness and dust. I woke at the base of the mountain at dawn, alone, with blood on my hands and no memory of how I had fallen. The village was gone. The ridge was smooth and silent. But sometimes, when the wind is right, I still hear a child humming from deep inside the stone, waiting for someone else to climb high enough to answer.